Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this professional learning opportunity, Gen Z and the Future of Religion. I am Bailey Cornelius, the Digital Project Coordinator at NCEA, and I will be facilitating this webinar today. A few housekeeping notes as people are joining. We will be recording this session today. If you have questions during the presentation, feel free to use the chat window, and we will monitor any questions and try to answer them all in the allotted time. At the end of the session, I will share a link to the online survey in the chat and instructions on how to receive the certificate of completion for the webinar. Today's presenter is Dr. Josh Packard, Executive Vice President of Strategy and Operations for NCEA. Josh Packard is the Executive Vice President of Strategy and Operations for NCEA, which I just said, where his focus is on helping to implement and monitor the 2023 NCEA strategic plan, as well as fostering and building team culture. He comes to NCEA with more than 15 years of experience as a professor, researcher, and executive focusing on changing forms of religious expression in America. He is one of the foremost experts in the spiritual lives of modern American youth and an accomplished researcher in the sociology of religion and new forms of religious expression. He has authored numerous books and articles in both popular and academic outlets, including Church Refugees, Sociologists Reveal Why People Are Done with Church, but Not Their Faith, and Meaning Making, 8 Values That Drive America's Newest Generations. Dr. Packard has a degree in sociology from Vanderbilt University. Before I turn it over to him, let us begin in prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Father, thank you for all these men and women who have given their talents to educating our young people. Through the challenges they encounter each day, lead them to an ever deeper appreciation of the sacred duty to which you have called them. May they be people of integrity so that they can be witnesses as well as teachers. We pray that the schools they lead will become places where our young people can experience your love in their lives. Thank you for our Catholic schools. Help us to pray without ceasing, to work without wavering, and to give without grudging in order to ensure the future of Catholic education for all our children. We make this prayer through your Son, Jesus Christ, our teacher and our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, Holy Spirit. And now I will hand it over to you, Josh.
Thanks, Bailey. That was great. We have got to do something about getting that introduction shorter. That was a mouthful. I don't know where that came from, but I appreciate it. It's an honor to be able to be here and to talk about this today. As I think, as many of our people who are following along at NCEA may know, but not everybody will know. This is a sort of this last few months marks new territory a little bit for NCEA. One of the things that we were trying to do is to respond to a few data points that are affecting schools and the church more generally. And they all have to do with this trend towards disaffiliation. And so what that means, I think, very practically for our educators is that we increasingly have our schools are filled with people who, maybe don't come with this very strong Catholic background or formation, or maybe even any at all. I was just talking back to one former superintendent who told me that now that his schools have like 40+% of new enrollees are not Catholic identifying, which is, I think, just is great in some ways. I mean, that's awesome that they see value in the education, and also presents real challenges for us. So how do we, it's imperative then, I think more so now than ever, that we really understand what's going on with young people and their faith lives. How, what kinds of things can we expect that they might engage with and respond to. So I'm thrilled to be able to be here and share some things with you today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We will make sure we've got this. Okay, there we go. I think we're rolling. If Bailey, if for some reason we're not seeing a title screen with my name on it and the titled webinar, then just let me know. But otherwise, we will get moving. Okay, so I want to start with this idea that the stories that we tell ourselves about the world, that they really matter. That we often advance a narrative around sometimes whole groups of people. We often fill in gaps, even with just very parts of information. And this is the thing that we've evolved to do as humans, that we take bits and pieces. We don't have to know the full story, I guess, is what I mean. That we're able to take pieces of information and construct a narrative around that. And it's one of the things that actually helps us to navigate the world very quickly. It's one of the things that separates humans from other animals here on Earth, is that we're able to take our past experiences and sort of generalize out from them. But we essentially knit these things in our head into stories about the way that the world works. And this is great. This is obviously incredibly useful. We don't have to, we don't have to spend time knowing everything or about something just in order to make a decision. We can make decisions pretty quickly with just some pieces of information. And so when I say that they matter, it's not just like cool because it helps us to get through the world more easily. The stories that we tell ourselves about the world matter because it informs the actions that we end up taking. So, for example, if like I'm here, I work from home, I'm looking out across the street, I've got this neighbor who every time when he walks his dog and I'm outside, like he never waves hello or does anything. Um, he just walks right on past me, and I don't know what that's about. I have theories and ideas, right? But like if I'm telling myself a story in my head that like, oh, he never waves hello, he's just a jerk, right? That's going to change the way that I interact with him. On the other hand, if I'm telling myself a story that's like maybe he deals with social anxiety or he's got a lot going on in his home life and his walk with the dog is his one time of day of some peace and quiet. Maybe you understand this as a teacher or educator. Then like that's gonna be like I'll interact with him in a whole different way. And so yes, the stories that we tell ourselves are very useful, and also it's really critical that we get these stories right, especially when we're talking about young people, because that changes, again, how we're going to interact with them in our classrooms. And I think for a long time now, we've sort of been telling ourselves the wrong stories about young people. That we tend to paint young people with a very broad brush. We're going to learn today a little about why we shouldn't do that. We tend to stereotype and we tend to make some sort of like sweeping generalizations about young folks that are based largely on our own experiences. At least is what the research shows, that we tend to categorize and group people based on our own experiences of when we had that status. So we try to understand what it's like to be young based on what it was like when we were young. And in today's presentation, I want to go through some of the reasons why I don't think that's like the right approach to understanding generations, especially our newest and youngest generations. That it's not only is it lead to inaccuracies, but I think it's not particularly useful. And we're going to hear from some young people themselves about the power of listening. And along the way, what we're going to do is try to reframe the ways that we think about generations around 4 giant social trends that are affecting Gen Z and Gen Alpha. So that's what we're going to be trying to do today. To broaden out and just sort of let you know how this fits into the rest of the content arc around this at NCEA. If you've been following along, you might have noticed like there've been a few blog posts about this. Megan Bissell and I did a very practical, hands-on webinar about listening tools that came out a couple months ago. You can go back and find it in the archives. That was a sort of a preview of the sacred listening tools you can see right behind me. The book there that came out at convention that was in everybody's bag and was part of the main stage presentation that we did at convention. You're going to be able to find that as a digital resource later on in the summer if you didn't get a hard copy or if you just want more. And we're going to keep following up on this over the course of the summer and into the fall with more content in this area. So this is sort of like a sort of bigger overview of generations, more of a think, more about it, changing the way that we think and approach this, as opposed to the practical stuff which you can find in some of these other resources and webinars. So with that in mind, when we say that we're telling ourselves the wrong stories about young people, I don't mean that we like collect it like those of us on the webinar, or even like those of us who are adults today. I mean like we adults, generally speaking, tend to tell ourselves the wrong stories about kids. And here's what I mean. So if we go back through history, what we find is that adults consistently say basically the wrong things and more or less the same wrong things about kids. So here we go. Aristotle, 4th century BCE. They think they know everything and are always quite sure about it. We're going to go through some more of these, and I think you're going to find that these are things that your parents might have said about you, and maybe they're even things that you have said about the students in your classroom or your own kids. Peter the Hermit, 13th century. The young people of today think of nothing but themselves. They have no reverence for parents or old age. They are impatient of all restraint. They talk as if they alone know everything, and what passes for wisdom with us is foolishness with them. They don't respect their elders, even in the 13th century and from a hermit. Reverend Enos Hitchcock in the 18th century, the free access which many young people have to romance novels. to romances, novels, and plays, has poisoned the mind and corrupted the morals of many a promising youth. Old people complaining about media. Nothing new under the sun, right? An editorial written to the whole Daily Mail in the 1900s. We defy anyone who goes about with his eyes open to deny that there is, as never before, an attitude on the part of young folk which is best described as grossly thoughtless, rude, and utterly selfish. And finally, here, Peter Kluger in the 21st century writing about millennials in the New York Times. Young people have forced us to become accustomed to preeners and posers who don't have anything to offer except themselves and their need to be on public stage. Okay, so basically, for as long as there have been teenagers, there have been adults complaining about these teenagers. And in some cases, yes, like, is this factually true? Like, I'm not here to say that Aristotle was a liar or that he was a dummy, certainly not. And not for any of these other people either. I don't even think that it's not true when we say these things about young people. But here's the shift in thinking that I think would serve us better, right? It's not that young people aren't narcissistic or that they're not selfish. And in fact, I'm not like here to convince you that somehow every teenager is actually altruistic and you just don't see it, or that they are actually the nicest people on earth, but just not when you're around or something like that. I don't think that's true at all. Instead, though, what I think we're doing is that we're seeing a few of these data points, and then we're telling ourselves a story about something that's immutable about their character. We're seeing them be selfish, and we're saying they are selfish. And in fact, what's happening, of course, if we stop and think about it for a little bit, is that they're kids. They're kids, and this is a normal process of development. They're going through a stage, ideally, they're going through a stage, right? With a little bit of guidance and help, they will emerge on the other side of not narcissistic, not selfish, not disrespecting their elders, et cetera, et cetera. Because of course, if all these people had been right, and this is an immutable fact about these generations, from Aristotle all the way to Peter Kluger, the world would have like devolved into total chaos and turmoil at this point, which maybe you don't think that things are as rosy as they should be, but it, by all accounts, has not devolved into total chaos. So we're left with this notion of like, this is just a normal part of being a teenager, in the same way that like throwing a tantrum is a normal part of being a toddler. But we don't think about toddlers as like, when we see a 3-year-old throwing a fit, or a 2-year-old, better put, we don't necessarily think like, oh, that's a bad kid. What do we say? We say, well, that's the terrible twos. We need to parent them through it. We just need to guide them. But for some reason, when they get to be 13, 14, 15 years old, and they do the equivalent of a 13-year-old throwing a fit, which is like, I don't know, slamming doors or being rude or something, we do start to slide over into this language that talks not about development, but about who they are as a person. And we know scientifically that their brains are not fully developed until they're in their early 20s, a bit earlier for girls, typically a bit later for boys. And socially, their development, as we're going to see, is not coming full until even a little bit later than that. So there's no particular reason why we should characterize whole generations in one way and then act accordingly. In fact, I think that we are much better off if we think about them as going through a particular stage, and then we guide and accompany them in that way. So, just as one more way to drive that home, there's this really great article that came out a couple of years ago from, or less just last year, from researchers at Columbia and Harvard. They teamed up to analyze 12 million survey responses from a bunch of surveys all over the world. And over again, they were surveying people about morality, right? And everybody in these surveys was like, yes, the world is on decline. Maybe you feel this way too. Like, morality is out the window. It's definitely worse today than when I was a kid. This is what all the surveys show going back decades, maybe longer, but the surveys can only go back decades. And the researchers come to a set of conclusions that says like, well, basically, everybody feels this way, but objectively, it's not true. Here's the key part that they write in this article, The Illusion of Moral Decline. Participants in the foregoing studies believed that morality has declined, and they believed this in every decade, in every nation that we studied. They believed that the decline began somewhere around the time they were born, regardless of when that was, again, across generations, and they believed that it continues to this day. They believed the decline was a result both of individuals becoming less moral as they move through time and of the replacement of more moral people themselves by less moral people, kids. And they believe that the people they personally know, is my favorite part, and they believe that the people they personally know and the people who lived before they did are the exceptions to this rule. In other words, everybody else is the problem, but not me and my friends, and not my parents, but everybody, all the other people, but not me and my friends and my parents and my family. And the researchers conclude about all of these things, they were almost certainly mistaken. Because, of course, we have actual measures of morality, of both internal and external. We have people self-reporting, as well as objective measures of morality around like theft and lawlessness and those kinds of things. And we have, not only do we not have evidence that that morality has been on the decline, in fact, we have evidence to the contrary. And when those exact same people in these surveys were asked if anything immoral had been done to them, what we find is that on the one hand, they say the world is less moral, and on the other hand, we have fewer people saying that immoral things happen to them personally. So there is this like narrative of young people, generations, the world is on decline, less morality, blah, blah, blah. But I don't think it's true. It's not true factually from what we can find from the evidence. And it's not true even if we think about it in terms of its utility. So when I mentioned earlier that it's not only is it not accurate to categorize young people in this way, I don't think it's particularly useful because it ends up sending us down a wrong pathway. If you tell yourselves a story about young people that they're less moral, or the world that it is on an inevitable slide to moral decline, I don't know what you do with that information, except get really defensive and protective. And that is the thing that the church cannot afford to be in today's day and age, is defensive and protective. The Gallup just released data recently showing that attendance among almost all faiths, but especially Christian faiths, is down on a weekly basis. Of course, we've all seen the rise of the nuns has been up. It's about a third of the population now that identifies with nuns. So the church can't really afford to take this position of, let's batten down. The rest of the world is immoral. We're the only ones that have the right answers. And let's not engage with them. We have to find a way to engage with them. And I think that starts with a shift in how we think, literally think about them. So when it comes to generations, rather than trying to box them up and say, all of you people are this thing, or all of you people are this other thing, what I think we want to do is think about them in terms of trends. So one of my favorite sociologists, I'm a sociologist by training, one of my favorite sociologists' name is Howard Becker. He talks about this as instead of thinking about types of people, we should be thinking about types of conditions. And what he means by that is that, even if we could put a label on somebody and say that that person is a delinquent, or that person is a good student, or that person is a bad father, we cannot fit everybody into those boxes very neatly. And B, more to the point, it's not a thing that can inform our action very well. Instead, what he offers, and the approach I think we should take to thinking about generations, is to thinking about sets of conditions that make people more or less likely to do something. The example I would always use in my classes when I taught was to say, am I a good student? And they would say, well, sure, you got a PhD and you're a professor and you must have been a good student. I would say, yeah, but there are definitely times that I failed tests and didn't prep for them. And they would be like, yeah, okay, well, it's just one test, still that other stuff holds. And like, well, what if it was like a lot of tests? Like, what if it was more, what if I failed more classes than I didn't? And they're like, well, that would cause more trouble. Like, what if I failed out of graduate school a couple of times before? See, we get to this point where it's like, I'm trying to push them to define, like, when do I fall out of one box and into another box? And we have a really hard time drawing those lines. And then invariably a student would be like, okay, why are we doing this, right? What's the point, right? And that's the point, that is exactly the point that I wanted to get to. Because what I think is a far more useful question to ask is, what are the conditions that would cause an otherwise good student to not study for a test? Like, what are the things impact? In my case, it was almost always certainly some girl I was trying to impress and staying out way too late, probably not to much success, by the way. But that was like invariably the condition that would have led to me otherwise acting outside of my behavior. that's the same kind of thing that Becker says that we should be doing around all types of people. What are the conditions that cause them to behave in a certain way? And I think there are 4 things when it comes to understanding Gen Z and Gen Alpha that cause them to behave more likely than not in some particular way. So let's go through each of these 4 in a little bit of depth. So the first thing that we want to understand about these generations is diversity. Diversity is not only a topmost value, it's also a very real experience in their lives. Now, I think this is surprising for a lot of parents who think this is just a talking point, or maybe even a lot of educators, because a lot of times our adults' lived realities are not very diverse. Still, our neighborhoods are fairly segregated. Our schools, especially our public schools, are very segregated, more segregated now than they were in 1953 before Brown versus the Board of Education. Not because of explicitly, overtly racist reasons, largely because of suburban growth and housing prices. But for young people who live life as much online as they do in person, this is not just about who they come into contact with physically. The diversity that's present in their lives extends far beyond their in-person contacts. There's also a lot of structural diversity. So when we say that's the most diverse generation in history, we're not just saying like, look around at skin color. I mean, there's a number of factors that go into it, and race and ethnicity are part of this. With Gen Z, nearly half identify as non-white. I'm going to put these, we're going to put all this stuff up here so you can go back and look at it if you want. We're not going to read all of them. Gen Alpha is projected to be the first majority minority generation in the US. And to the previous point, they're more likely to have friends of different races and ethnicities than any other previous generations. They're more likely to be the children of immigrants than anybody else. So amidst all of the conversation that you see on the news about immigration and who should get in and who shouldn't get in and under what circumstances and all of this, it's important to remember that we currently have in this country more young people who are the children of immigrants than we've had at any point in recent history. At least one foreign-born parent. It's true about religion. The Gen Z is less likely to identify as Christian. This is the rise of the nuns that I referred to earlier. Pew says 26% of Gen Zers are religiously unaffiliated. Some places put that closer to 30, 32%. But nevertheless, it's about a fourth to a third of young people identifying with no religious affiliation. And that is an all-time high by far, at least in the last century. They're very diverse on social issues. They're more likely to support same-sex marriage than previous generations, but still there's a fair amount of mixture there. 53% of millennials, 70% of Gen Zers, they're more likely to support gender equality than previous generations. And household arrangement, like what kind of places are they growing up in? Well, they're more likely to have grown up in a household with 2 working parents than previous generations. 61% of Gen Zers with 2 working parents compared to 57% of millennials, 50% of Gen X, and 46% of baby boomers. And most of that is due to just the financial realities of trying to raise kids in today's economy and in today's world. And if we were to dig further, we would see even more of this, especially around household arrangement when it comes to divorce and blended families and multi-generational families and things like that. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for us to think about Gen Z and Gen Alpha as just any one thing. Not only is not only is diversity a structural part of their lives, it's also a value for them. So given all of this diversity that's present for them structurally, they tend to hold diversity in very high esteem. And so when we make broad sweeping statements about them or treat them in broad sweeping ways, it doesn't pass the smell test for them because they're used to nuance, they're used to diversity. They want to see all that reflected in the adults and then the people that they're interacting with. So diversity, that's number one. We got to keep that in mind that in the past, maybe if we were to talk about like all of Gen X or something, we might have been capturing a good chunk of the population such that it would be like, okay, we're not talking about everybody, but we're at least talking about enough of them that we're probably not missing too many. Now, if we were to say something about like all Gen Z is fill in the blank, we're almost certainly getting it wrong more often than we're getting it right. In fact, it's that position that led Pew Research Institute to recently say that they're going to stop talking about generations in this way. The diversity is just so much that they're like, this has lost all of its utility to try and categorize them as more liberal or that they support this social issue over that social issue or something like that. It just doesn't work. It gives us a false confidence that we're capturing an entire group of people when we're not, and ultimately in a bad way can lead to a lot of stereotypes that are simply not true. Second social trend has to do with their social development. And the way, I think what the best way to say this that I've come to that I've been able to figure out is that based on all the data that we're seeing, I think that this very diverse generation, this most diverse generation, is growing up differently than any other generation before them. And the way they're growing up is both like fast and slow at the same time. And here's what I mean by that. So on the one hand, like they do, I don't know if you've noticed this, but I hear this all the time. I see it too. Like I have my own son who's 14, and we're trying to like parent and coach out of this, but I see it in a lot of his friends that like they have trouble doing some of the what I think previous generations would have been considered to be like basic things. Like, can you look somebody in the eye, like an adult especially? Can you hang out with your friends? Do you want to hang out with your friends in person even? Can you make change? Can you talk in public? Can you shake hands? Like all of these things that my parents would have been like, well, this is just part of being an adult or even like just a person in the world. This generation not only doesn't know how to do it in many cases, but they experience a lot of anxiety about being asked or put in a position where they have to do it. And this is part of growing up slow. We know this from not just anecdotal things that people are telling us, but also from a lot of what would you call them, like rites of passage, milestones and markers. So 16 is the age that you can drive in most states. I don't know if you've seen this, but it's like we're living it with a 14-year-old where he's got some of his older friends who are just like not getting driver's licenses. In fact, we know from the data that the age of getting your driver's license is going up and up. The age that young people are going to college is going up. The age that they leave the house, much to the chagrin of probably all the parents on this call, the kids are leaving the house later and later. I think that age is all the way up to 25 now by the time they leave the house that they were raised in. And the age at first marriage is all the way up to 30. Along those same lines, a lot of the other sort of that you would consider to be, in many cases, like destructive but normal parts of teenagerhood are also down. So like they don't smoke as much, they don't drink as much, they don't have as much premarital or unprotected sex. That they engage in far less risky behavior. So they're just sort of like doing normal life things less or slower. And in some ways, if that's all adults see, which in many cases that is all that adults see, then they want to bucket and categorize all of Gen Z, Gen Alpha as like, oh, look, see, like they just don't care, they're not engaged, they're lazy, they're they don't have the grit or the what the stuff that it takes to be, they need to toughen up or something like that. But when we look at their online lives, especially, what we find out is that in many cases, they're growing up faster than any other generation has. They are more engaged around social issues by all metrics than any generation before them. They're more knowledgeable about world events than anybody that's come before them. And so they're more exposed to like a diversity of ideas, to like real world events, like the constant onslaught of big and sometimes often terrible things that are going on in the world are filtering into their social media feeds and interactions online. And so while in some ways it brings more knowledge, it also brings more anxiety. And this creates a weird kind of like cognitive dissonance for them. It's a paradox to be growing up so fast in one place that dominates a lot of your interactions, and then so slow in the spaces where adults see you and often evaluate you. And I was testing this idea out with a young person as I was like writing this for a book. And James tells me, he's like, he goes, I'm going to read this to you. He says, that's right. And we get it. We're not great at the in-person stuff. It's taking us longer to learn. But part of it is that I'm just so wary of listening to some adult tell me how to act when they can't even seem to understand that the world is literally on fire, or understand even the basics of pronouns, or why Russia's invasion of Ukraine is so important, or a million other things that I see online every day. And I think that, I mean, it was so critical, when James said it like that for me. I was like, oh, that like you're not interested in adults telling you where you're coming up short, because you find that they're often not even giving you credit for what you do know, and in fact like sort of discrediting themselves. um, and I think that's in many cases because we sort of like write off what's happening online because we don't see it in many cases as like not real. um, but as Emma, a young person, told me after a talk one time, she said, when adults dismiss my online life, they disqualify themselves from speaking into my life. And I thought it was such a, she'd clearly been thinking about that phrase and how she wanted to say it to me. She said, when adults dismiss my online life, they disqualify themselves from speaking into my life. And so I've held on to that quote for so long because that is where so much growing up is happening, is online. And we should try and balance that out when we think about young people. Those conditions change the way that they behave. And in fact, I think, you probably heard this term IRL, in real life. Like, if you are primarily interacting with somebody online or whatever, you get to go to a conference, maybe you saw somebody that you haven't seen in a while, or only interact with on Facebook or whatever at NCEA convention a couple of weeks ago. You might have taken a selfie and said like, oh look, it's me and Julie IRL in real life, right? And a young person put this I was telling the story, I was using the same example one time, and this young person told me later that they wrote me an email and they said, there's no on in real life in my life. Like this like IRL versus online is not a thing. Like it's just in my life, IML. Like these things are like they move back and forth for us very fluidly. And I think that when so much of what you consider to be your life goes dismissed by or overseen or overlooked by the adults, there's some pretty dramatic consequences that come along with that. Like not only do you not know how to, as a teenager, like deal with that criticism, but you don't feel like you're being listened to and heard, and especially that you're not being heard around the issues and things where you feel like you excel a lot or know a lot. It can lead to some concepts, concepts of self that are maybe not where we would like them to be. So this is from a study that just came out by Young Life last week. A couple of weeks ago, they did a big multinational study about Gen Z called Relate. It's at relate.younglife.org, something like that. You can go and find it if you want to download the chapters. But man, this was the data point that really stuck out to me. I believe I am worthy of being loved. Only 59% of young people had a strong level of agreement with that, and 41% did not. And to me, the connection between these things was just pretty clear. That so often that they get criticism from adults, criticism, because today's young people are not meeting yesterday's milestones. And some of that criticism is warranted. Like we do want them to grow up. We do need them to get out of our homes and get jobs, right? But they're not also simultaneously, in many cases, given an opportunity to show where they excel or be listened to by adults about where they do have thoughts and things where they could actually shine, but we just don't know it because it's not a part of our lives, because it wasn't something that existed when we were young. So this is obviously a data point that I think we can all agree that we would like to change. I believe I'm worthy of being loved. And part of that Relate study also shows that, to come back to a recurring theme for all this work that we're doing here at NCEA, one of the best ways that we can do that is to listen to them. You're going to see that come up over and over again, that when people feel like they're worthy of being loved is when they feel valued, and they feel valued when they're listened to, especially by adults. Theme number 3, loneliness. Young adults are twice as likely to be lonely as seniors. This is from a Morning Consult survey in 2021, commissioned by Cigna. So Cigna first did this work in the 2016, 2017, 60,000 US adults established that for the first time in the history of doing this work around loneliness from a lot of academics and health providers and others, that young people were the loneliest cohort, not old people as it had always been before 2017. The pandemic has accelerated that, has changed behavior patterns, has increased loneliness. And so now we've got what many people, including the Surgeon General in lots of states, have called a loneliness epidemic among teenagers. And it comes with, I think, a lot of consequences that are really critical. Here's this is from the Atlantic, data gathered from 12th graders, compiled and analyzed by Jean Twenge, who you might know as the author of Generations and some other really great books about young people. This is the percent of teens who say they go out with their friends in person 2 times a week or more in 12th graders. So this is, again, this is like 18, 19-year-olds. I think it's important to point out, because at 18 and 19 years old, I was going out with my friends 75 times a week, not 2 times, like every conceivable opportunity. And you can see just how not only, I mean, I don't know, a 60 and somewhere in the 50s to low 60s% is good or bad, but you can see that it's a dramatic drop from previous generations. It held steady until about the year 2000, and we start to see it drop off over the last 20 years pretty precipitously. And this goes back, well before the pandemic. And I think does come with some pretty important consequences. We already saw the one about being loved. Here's Varun Soni, the Dean of Religious Life at USC, writing in the LA Times a few years back. He said, whereas students used to ask, how should I live? They are now more likely to ask, why should I live? Where they used to talk about hope and meaning, now they grapple with hopelessness and meaninglessness. And I never got the question in my first 5 years at USC that I now get almost daily from students. How do I make friends? Students may have thousands of friends online, but few in real life, and they may be experts at talking with their thumbs, but not so much with their tongues. I think it's really important here to note that Varun is talking about this as a skill set, not a personality trait. The experts at talking with their thumbs, but not experts at talking with their thumbs, but not tongues. As a result, many feel as though they don't have a tribe or a sense of belonging. They feel disconnected from what it means to be human. So look, their online interactions are absolutely critical. Like, the answer here is not take away their phones and their social media and things like that. That would be the same as, cutting off oxygen almost to them. I mean, not quite, but a pretty close second. But online life is the same as regular life, in the sense that, like, not everything that happens there is bad, but not everything that happens there is great, and not everything that happens there is enough. That even though it might be easier, and as teenagers you might not know better than to keep yourself from harm, as parents and educators and trusted adults, we're there to show them the way, not to shut things down and prohibit them, but to teach them how to act in those spaces, and to let them know that it needs to be regulated, that it's really important for their soul to be balanced with in-person interactions. This is a critical thing and part of what it means to be human, and that we can foster more of these and create more of these. And again, I'm speaking from a position as a parent. I mean, we know I've done a lot. I've personally done a lot of this research. And yet we watch this unfold with our own son, and we do, all the time we're encouraging, like, okay, how do we guard against this? We're having conversations at the dinner table. We're explicitly helping him to craft text messages to friends to invite them to come over and be, in person, face to face, while also teaching him, okay, you want to be on your Oculus and you want to play video games with your friends. How are you going to act and behave there? This is a social, like a real social space with consequences, just like every other social space. Too often, though, what we see and hear from young people is that their online spaces are just largely unregulated. Their social lives are largely unguided. And so to retreat to something that is easier in the exact moment, to be online, to not have to face the consequences of in-person interactions, to not have to go through the potential social exclusion or pain of you saying something and it doesn't go well face to face. Well, it might be easier right then, but you're doing them a disservice over the long haul. And I think it comes at the cost of their humanity, and as Varun Soni is pointing out, at their spirituality. So the fourth big trend that we need to understand that's impacting these newest generations does have to do with this disaffiliation and the rise of the nuns. It's not so much that young people are disaffiliating, it's that their parents have disaffiliated. So what we've got is a generation of parents who are actively not engaging with religious institutions, which is concerning, because another piece of research that I've been an advisor on that will come out later in the summer, looking at young nuns, NONESs, when they have kids, showing that they have no particular plans for their religious formation or education. Even if they're thinking about putting them into a religiously based school, they're not thinking about it for religious reasons. And what that research and others is finding is that nonness is really sticky. Nonness transfers from generation to generation more likely than affiliation does. So it's an important thing to understand that a lot of your kids are walking into with either parents who have rejected regular institutional engagement, or at least probably likely on the fence about it, and almost certainly have friends who have done that. As further evidence to this point, this is the Gallup study that I mentioned earlier, that came out last month, showing a frequency of attendance at religious services is weekly attendance. You see all US adults there, attendance is down 12% from over the last 20 years. And it's been a little bit every year, and we don't see any particular signs that this is going to slow down. Pew is projecting that if current, with the way current data is, these are the projections for 2070. If things stay the same, if there's some rising disaffiliation, and even in situation number 4, if this is just sort of things, just if there's not an increase in percentage but just numbers. In any case, they're dismissive of number 4. They're almost certain that it will be the betting future, so to say, would say scenario 1 or 2. But even a lot of people arguing for 3. Nevertheless, a declining share of the population that is identifying as Christian, a little bit of a rise in other religions, but nowhere near the majority, and a marked uptick in the unaffiliated population, such that it's entirely possible that by 2070, the majority of the country is unaffiliated, not affiliated in some way. This transfers over to Gen Z. When we asked them, this is from Springtide Research Institute when I was the executive director, they're leading some research around young people. How often do you attend religious services, either in person or virtually? Well, 34% say they attend never, 30% only once a year or less. So this is obviously not true for the students in your school. I mean, they're attending religious services often, not daily. But they're living in a world that does not look like that at all. The reason for this decline, or this change in the way that people are thinking about and believing in religion and faith and spirituality, largely comes down to trust. Which I talk about trust a lot, nearly every presentation I give, because I think it's the hidden factor in all of these, behind all of these things, that we just don't trust institutions. Social science has been tracking this, Pew, Gallup, General Social Survey, on and on. Been tracking confidence or trust, depending on the wording of the survey, in institutions and their leaders now for like 50, 60, 70 years in some cases. And the trend is just overwhelmingly down. Down and down and down. In fact, the most recent Gallup data about leaders, this is about institutions that you see here, the most recent Gallup data about leaders showed teachers, clergy, bankers, et cetera, all at or near all-time lows. That just came out this past summer. And it's not that we think that, what's really interesting about this data is not that we think that those are bad people. In fact, we tend to like our pastor. We tend to like our kid's teacher. We don't trust the profession of pastor. We don't trust the institution of church. And so that changes the way that we engage with those institutions. It means in general that we just don't engage with them as much. And Nancy Ammerman is a famous sociologist, put it this way. She said, in a time of significant change, we cannot assume that we will find religion in the predictable places or in the predictable forms. And if we do not find as much of it in those predictable places as we did before, we cannot assume that it is disappearing. She went on to say at a conference, she wrote that in a great book, that first part, in a great book called Sacred Stories and Spiritual Tribes. At a conference, and I heard her say, we're only just now coming to terms with the fact that more and more religion happens outside of traditional institutions. So we're seeing a decline in religious affiliation. We're seeing pretty high rates and uptick in people noting themselves as spiritual, to the extent that Pew and Fetzer and some others for the first time have been releasing studies about spirituality, whereas before this captured such a small slice of the population who were spiritual only, that they didn't bother with full studies. Now they've said, not only are we going to do the study, but we're going to stay in this space for a long time. What this means then, I think the implications for us as educators is that we've got a lot of students and families and who are coming to our schools who are interested in something beyond themselves. They remain very engaged in that conversation, but they sort of lost the grammar or architecture for how to do institutional expressions of faith. So like a confessional faith, a sacramental faith doesn't resonate with them. They don't have the experience with it. It may not even mean as much to them as it once did, even though they're still generally very open and receptive and interested in conversations about God and the divine and the sacred. So our runway to get to something that is more sacramental, that is more confessional, might have to be longer, right? That we can't put them through the same process and expect the same results, because often it means that we're starting in places that they just aren't. That much of our faith formation, religious formation in the Catholic world is built around a set of assumptions that just don't exist for our incoming students, especially our youngest ones. So what do we do in that regard? Well, all the data that I've seen, all the data I've collected, all the research shows that listening is the one thing that changes everything. That in order to rebuild trust, in order to get to a place where young people actually will listen to the things that you're saying, you have to listen to them first. And I think that this point is vitally critical. It's why we're doing sacred listening tools, right? That at NCEA, and it's where it's also a place where I think educators can play a very large role in the lives of young people, especially in their faith development, who are not necessarily teaching a religion class, who are not campus ministers necessarily, who are not even, you don't necessarily have to be trained in religion to have a big role in their accompaniment. And I think even a little bit of permission giving to say, like, when you sit and listen to a young people, you're not doing nothing. In fact, you might be doing the most important thing. And that we need to start as educators and classroom teachers, maybe doing a little bit of educating up to our administrators and bosses that this is actually really, really vital and critical work that doesn't always show up on performance reviews, but that I think you should be getting credit for, because there might not be anything more important. To that point, at convention, if you were there, you saw this, hopefully, but if not, we're going to watch just a short clip here of young people who are on stage at our main stage event talking about the importance of listening. And you're going to get to hear them talk about what listening means to them. So this will go about 5 minutes or so.
So welcome. Thank you all for being here. We have Alex and Marissa and Jack. So I'm about to do my best Oprah impression. You do not get cars, but I do get to sit next to a couch and talk to kids. So thank you all so much. We're so thrilled to have you. Get comfortable, take a deep breath. We are not in a giant room with a lot of people on a gianter stage. We're just gonna chat about things in your life. Tell us about an adult in your life that has made an impact because they value what you say.
There's a lot.
I knew
There's
this
a
was
lot of those people. And so many teachers that I've had over the years. I've gone to Catholic education since I was in first grade, and it's been fantastic. And it's such an incredible experience. And I can remember one of the greatest classes I've ever had for one of the greatest teachers I've ever had was in fourth grade, Miss Grice, and I know she's here today because I saw her outside. But Miss Grice was and still is a fantastic teacher, and we had religion classes with her where we would sit in a circle and around the room. She would sit at the top, and she would sit down with us, and she would just cut the crap. And she would just talk to us about what was going on, especially it was a bigger topic that we were discussing in religion class. She would sit down with us, tell her experience with it, and we would throw it around the room. We threw it around the room, and it was really a powerful time where we're only in fourth grade, so we're 10 years old, and we're talking about bigger topics with a teacher that we love and respect, and it made us all feel like we mattered in that discussion, that our opinions mattered, our questions mattered, and particularly so we could better understand what we were talking about and gain a greater understanding of our own. Because I think at the same time, listening is so important, but it's not just hearing, it's listening. Because everybody with 2 ears can hear, but not everyone with 2 ears listens, and we know this. Because we see all these people every day that just don't listen. But listening is so crucial. Miss Grace was a tremendous example of how to listen and to make everyone around her feel important.
She wrangled a room full of 10-year-olds. That is memorable enough for him to still. That's amazing. If you're here, I would like to meet you later and say thank you for the work that you do. Marissa, how about you?
I also have a lot. Specifically in terms of my school, I would definitely say Mrs. KR. I didn't see her. I hope she's here. But I'm lucky enough to have her as a teacher for a new class this year, which is Catholic Entrepreneurship and Design, which Mrs. Decker is also here. She teaches.
That's a cool class.
And both of them together, I think, that's just such an amazing class because we're able to talk about kind of like the deep questions, and they're always there. And I feel like I'm always able to go to them no matter what's going on in my life. Specifically, Mrs. KR, I've known her since I came into St. LaSalle. I didn't know anybody when I came in. And it was really special to have someone who, like, even this year, I just go into your office all the time and I'm like, hey, like, I'm having a bad day, or like, I'm having difficulties with like this friendship or this class or whatever. And it's always just so special because I can just sit there and feel like the rest of the world doesn't really exist. And I'm just talking to someone who's really, really listening to me, and hearing everything I say and offering such amazing advice. So I hope she's here. I haven't seen her, but thank you.
Jack, share.
Yeah, so for me, like I said, it's kind of hard to pick anybody at Central because most of the teachers know me normally as the kid who passes out the slips who they don't really want to take one, so I'm not always liked in the morning. But yeah, there's so many people I'd say at Central, but I'm actually going to go back to someone I mentioned in the first question who has since passed away, but she was my 6th grade teacher. Her name was Mrs. Fowler. And she was like a second mom to me, to be honest. So I lived across the street from my grade school. And so I'd get there very early in the morning. And I remember one time my parents were, they were away on vacation. So it was just me and my older brother. And like the night before, I got no sleep. And I was like, I walked into her room and she was like, Jack, you look terrible. What happened? And so we had like a 10-minute conversation. She made me some tea. So pretty much she just acted like a second mom that day. And that single moment and that single morning has stuck with me every single day. Just how caring she really was. It wasn't just to me. You could see it was to everybody, her colleagues, her students. And so I'd say I have to say her for someone that truly made me feel heard and loved.
That's wonderful. God rest her soul. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it. Well, folks, that's all the time we have with these young people today, unfortunately.
Hey, so here's the thing that I adore about this. So like of course, that was Megan Bissell. She's on our team here at NCEA. She's doing the interview. She had worked with these young people, prepped them. We wanted to set them up for success on stage. And so we're not just like springing questions on them in front of 3,000 people. When they had the time to sit and think over a period of weeks about what they wanted to say in response to the question, what is a time that listening has impacted your life? They're not talking about like some advanced question, some really hard question about, if God is good, why do bad things happen in the world? And, or some book knowledge or some teaching that they got. Even when they're talking about specific moments, they're still talking about things that are often the moments that go sort of unnoticed, that we wouldn't necessarily consider to be remarkable. And it's such a startling reminder to me of like your opportunity to make a difference in the life of a young person, and to what it means to be like an impactful adult in their life, but also a good example of the faith, and to bring them back to a holistic understanding of their life as it fits into what God wants for them, often happens in those in-between moments. And we need to be prepared for that. Like it makes me both excited, like, oh my gosh, look at that was really cool. Like that kid held on to that moment for so long. And also it makes me very nervous. I'm like, oh, I want every adult and teacher to understand this because I don't want those moments to slip by. I don't want them to, be taken casually. Like increasingly based on what we're hearing from the data and what we're seeing in the data and what we're hearing from one-off conversations with young people, is that those are the moments that truly matter, especially when you can start to string them together, when you get to be known as the person who listens. Then you become a critical resource in your life. And I want to close with just, if you're on LinkedIn or whatever, you might have seen this. I like to take it as a challenge to sort of sum up some very complicated data in the simplest ways possible. So I've been drawing these crayon illustrations rather than doing a bunch of charts and tables. And I think you could take all of that data, all of the research that we've talked about, and I don't think we need more. I don't think we need a better understanding. I think that really the only data that matters is whatever helps us to close the gap between what we think we know about somebody and what their actual lived reality is. And you can't get that from a study from Pew. You can't get that from a national data set, right? You can only get that by listening intently to the young person across from you. Not only is this the thing that will close the gap between you and them, but we have every indication to believe that this is the pathway towards revitalizing not only their own faith lives, but in fact, not to put too much weight on the shoulders here, but this is the pathway back to vitality for the church as a whole. I think we as educators, you as educators, have a more important role in this regard than maybe anybody else, because you see young people more often than anybody else sees them. And so I just want to encourage you, as you go back, dig into the resources about the very practical how-tos about how to listen. We think about these generations in terms of their diversity, how they're growing up, how religion is impacting them, right? How we think about the trends, about how they're likely to behave, that they're not going to respond to these top-down institutional sources of traditional sources of knowledge and wisdom, at least not until we have taken all these other parts of their lives into account and gotten to know their realities by doing some very distinct listening to help pave the way. Okay, so that's what I've got. Thank you so much for being here today. I've really appreciated this. It's been a wonderful opportunity to get a chance to share a little bit of this. And please do keep following along with this stream of research and resources that are coming out of NCEA over the last few months and continuing on through the summer into the fall.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you for attending today's NCEA webinar. NCEA continuously strives to improve the quality of our services for our members based on feedback. We will use your input to inform future work and improve services. The survey should take about 5 minutes to complete, and it has already been dropped into the chat. If you are interested in a certificate of attendance, please include your email address and name at the end of the survey. Since your certificate will be sent via automated email, please check your spam, and if you do not see an email within a few minutes, check your spam. Thank you again, and have a wonderful rest of your day.